Hey everyone, give me 30 seconds. First, Seacord Stories is throwing a dating show at the Press Room September 13th. We already have lots of fun single women coming to the show, and we need some more men. If you are a single man listening to this, or if you're a woman who knows a single man, then please send them the link in the show notes. This may just be the opportunity you need to meet the love of your life. Secondly, Seacord Stories Dinner Club is going to Kittery on September 17th. I want to take over Forsyth and make this the biggest night yet. If you want to meet like-minded people for dinner and eat at one delicious Kittery restaurant, followed by a meetup at a bar afterwards, then just sign up at the link in the show notes. Hope to see you then. Now on to today's episode. Welcome to Seacoast Stories, a podcast about the people, businesses, and newsmakers that make the Seacoast an American hidden gem. I'm Trey Farkas, and on today's episode, the story of how the citizens of Portsmouth saved the world from destruction. You may think that's an exaggeration, but it's not. My favorite Portsmouth fun fact is that the Russo-Japanese War, fought between Imperial Russia and Japan in the early 1900s, was ended by the Treaty of Portsmouth, a document signed at the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard 120 years ago, this coming Friday. When I first learned of this, I thought to myself, how is that possible? Why would a war between Russia and Japan end in the United States and in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, of all places? That very question is answered in my conversation today with Stephanie Seacord, the Director of Public Affairs for the Portsmouth Treaty Anniversary Committee. On today's episode, which is presented by Sea Love Portsmouth and Chinburg Properties, Stephanie and I discuss how President Theodore Roosevelt got these two sides to the negotiating table, why New Hampshire volunteered to host the talks, what actually happened at the shipyard in August of 1905, and most importantly, why the treaty may not have happened if it weren't for the actions of Portsmouth citizens. Plus, why the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard is in Kittery, and a slew of other Seacoast fun facts. But first, the backstory of the war. So, since the year 1330, Japan had existed in isolation. It wasn't until the 1850s, when the American Commodore Perry arrived and threatened to open a trading port there, that the Japanese finally realized, we can't just chill over here anymore. We have to get involved. So, they spent the ensuing decades building up military and modernizing their country. So when the ever-expanding Russia took control of Korea in the 1890s, little Japan grew fearful that the big bad Russians would target them next. Japan's concerns were validated when Russia began building the Trans-Siberian Railroad in Korea and when they took control of Port Arthur, which, geographically speaking, meant that the Russians were basically pointing their guns at Japan. Japan then tried to talk Russia down, but to no avail. Soon after, the Japanese attacked Russia at Port Arthur, signaling the start of the Russo-Japanese War. Russia was shocked, and the world was shocked, that tiny Japan had made such a bold move. And Russia back then, similar to Russia and Ukraine today, was unprepared, disorganized, and they did not have their best troops fighting against Japan. They were stationed in Korea. So, Japan continued winning battle after battle in a war that is now known as World War Zero. Why? Because the British were allied with the Japanese, the French with the Russians, the Germans were on both sides, meaning that if any one of these entangling alliances got involved, you'd have several countries at war. Additionally, the Russo-Japanese War was the first modern war where steel battleships, barbed wire, and heavy artillery were all at play. And on the other side of the world, the United States had taken notice. I know it's hard to believe, but up until this point, the US had mostly strayed from diplomacy and international affairs. But President Theodore Roosevelt wanted to change that. He had hoped to insert America not only as a military power, but also as an influence in global affairs and belief systems. So when Roosevelt made the decision to mediate peace talks between Russia and Japan, the talks that would soon happen in Portsmouth, it marked the official entrance of America as a global force for good. That's enough of me. Here's Stephanie Seacord with the story.
In May of 1905, what ultimately was the last battle, although the war was officially continuing, the Russians sent their Baltic fleet all the way around Africa, up through the Indian Ocean to get to Japan. The goal was that at this point, the land battles had been decisively won by the Japanese, but the Russians thought, well, we'll get our fleet over to the Pacific and base them in Vladivostok now that Port Arthur had fallen. So they sent their ships around, and in a battle that is still studied at the naval academies of the world, the Battle of Tsushima, the Japanese defeated the entire fleet, 37 ships. And again, the world is like, not only do the Japanese win all the land battles, but they beat the Imperial Russian Navy. This is nuts.
What an entrance onto the world stage.
Exactly.
So quickly, too.
Yeah. So Roosevelt is watching all of this. And that defeat was the moment that the Tsar finally said, okay, maybe this isn't worth pursuing battles that we just keep getting beaten. And there are many who say now that one of the critical issues in resolving the war in Ukraine is that Russia hasn't had its Tsushima yet. They don't see that this is not going to go anywhere. So the Russians and the Japanese, through back-channel diplomacy to Roosevelt, because they recognize that Roosevelt is actively interested and the United States is neutral and has influence with the world bankers who are funding this war. So they both approach Roosevelt with the idea of his hosting a mediation, which he, of course, immediately agrees to. In the meantime, New Hampshire gets involved because the word is announced through the media that the United States is going to host this peace conference. At first, both sides wanted the negotiations to be closer to them. I think the Russians were talking about somewhere in Europe, and Japan was looking at Asia, and of course, neither one would go in the other's territory. So it came to the United States. Both sides agreed that, okay, Washington would be fine. Mm-hmm. And by this time, it's June, and nobody wants even now to negotiate in Washington, D.C. in August, especially if you don't have air conditioning.
Right.
So Roosevelt makes it known that he is looking for a place for the negotiations that will be comfortable, that won't be hot and humid. So the governor and executive council of New Hampshire say, how about New Hampshire? It would be great for tourism, but it would be great for our fame and reputation. Huh. And the owners of the Mount Washington Hotel that had just been built and built by railroad interests, of which Roosevelt was not very fond. He is the railroad buster.
Right.
But they volunteered. The Governor McLean, and the executive council signed a letter to the State Department inviting the peace conference to come to the Mount Washington.
Wow.
So, and no other state stepped forward. No other state ever did step forward.
Wow, interesting.
But
I'm surprised that no other state saw the opportunity that New Hampshire did.
Exactly. And Roosevelt made it clear that he needed as neutral a place for the peace conference as the United States was. So you might think Bar Harbor or Newport or even Boston as coastal cities, except all of them had connections with the Russians. Because,
really?
Yes, another fun fact.
What is Bar Harbor's connection to Russia?
Exactly. So there were expatriate Russian nobility who had summer homes, particularly in Newport, but Bar Harbor and Newport with the Russian nobility. And post-Civil War, the robber barons, wealthy Gilded Age people of the United States who had daughters, had everything they wanted except for a royal title. So if their daughters married Russian nobility, then that would be the gilding on the Oval Office. So that's why Bar Harbor and Newport weren't considered neutral enough. Boston had a different problem, which was that, of course, Boston has a huge Irish population. Because the Japanese were allied with the English, they were afraid that the Irish would protest the Japanese for being in the city.
England, Ireland, big enemies.
So you end up with New Hampshire raising its hand. So we still don't know exactly how it played out that the invitation to the Mount Washington turned into Portsmouth and the Naval Shipyard. But we know Roosevelt was former Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He had said he wouldn't insert himself at the negotiating table, that the Russians and the Japanese needed to negotiate face to face, which is part of what had happened with the Japanese-Chinese treaty, that because it wasn't face to face, the outside powers could intervene. So Roosevelt is the one who decided, not Mount Washington. Love the enthusiasm. New Hampshire's fantastic. It's great that you're volunteering, but how about Portsmouth Naval Shipyard for the protocol, the security, all of that?
Okay.
And there was a meeting at the White House with Senator Chandler and Senators Gallinger and Burnham from New Hampshire. And at that meeting on the 21st of June, the decision shifted to Portsmouth. And 20 years I've been looking for the line in somebody's diary, even Chandler's diary, which is in Concord. It's this great little leather-bound, gilded-edged book. He talks about the meeting, but he doesn't exactly say Roosevelt said, no, I want it in Portsmouth. Yeah. It's just this inference.
Wow. Okay. So we don't know why it ultimately didn't end up in Washington, but it happened in Portsmouth.
And we know that the Navy was critical to Roosevelt because he understood that the Navy understood international protocol,
right? Which
was a huge deal, especially if you're hosting a peace conference between Japan, which was as formal then as it is now, and Imperial Russia.
Yeah, big deal.
Somebody needed to know how many guns to fire in the salute, and who came first out of the launch from the ship in the harbor and all that kind of stuff.
There's a whole pageantry to it.
And the security, and it happened, I mean, the shipyard would have figured out something, but they had just in the last, I think it was about 5 years, completed a warehouse building, a brick building, which is still there. It's Building 86. The names of all of the buildings at the shipyard are numbered in order of when they were built. So only the Navy. So Building 86 was this brand new brick warehouse that had big open spaces on the second floor. And it was relatively central to the waterfront, has this big ornate entry and all that good stuff. So they decided that they could convert that building, that second floor, into a conference room and anterooms for the secretaries and a luncheon room and all that kind of stuff. So June 22nd is when the decision is made that, okay, we're going to go to Portsmouth. Admiral Meade, who was the guy in charge in Portsmouth, did not get official orders from the Navy to convert the second floor of Building 86 until August 2nd.
Okay.
So he's sitting, the world is saying, oh, everybody's coming to Portsmouth. And he's saying, well, yes, so they tell me.
Classic.
But
Everything
the Navy has
second.
not issued orders. They did on August 2nd.
Wow.
The delegates are due on August 8th. And he had 300 people from the yard converting this second floor working day and night into formal meeting rooms. They brought in mahogany furniture from Washington and Oriental rugs and a chef and Marines from Boston, et cetera, et cetera. Meanwhile, the two leads for the negotiations are leaving Japan and Russia. Sergius Vitae, who he ended up as a finance minister. He was very involved in Russia's development of railroads, so he knew a lot about how the Siberian Railroad had gone and Korea and all that. But he was the lead diplomat. He was also like 6'3". And Baron Yutaro Komura was the lead Japanese plenipotentiary.
What?
The head guy. And he had negotiated the Sino-Japanese Treaty, the Japan-China thing. So they both finally arrived in New York the end of July, met separately with Roosevelt, who at this point was at Sagamore Hill on Long Island, Oyster Bay, Long Island.
Oh, yes, I've been there before.
It's a cool house.
Yeah.
So that was like the formal greeting place for both of them.
Very cool.
Yeah. So they each meet, and Roosevelt tells each of them, which was brilliant as Roosevelt as a mediator. There was a list of demands. Again, because the Japanese had won all the battles, they presented their list of 12 demands to the Russians. Both sides knew this before they ever got to Portsmouth. Roosevelt said, if you run into a difficulty, skip over it. Go on to the next thing. Keep going. The whole goal in mediation is to keep going. And by the time you get through 8, 9, 10 of 12 demands and you've agreed or you're close to agreeing, are you going to drop everything and go back to war for those two things? The goal is not. Keep going. So he gave them both those instructions.
So this was kind of like a pre-Portsmouth meeting?
Yeah, this is kind of setting encouraging, not even ground rules, but giving advice to both of them, knowing that he's not going to be at the table and promise not to be, because he knew, like the rest of the world knew, that if he were at the table, it would be all about Roosevelt, which he didn't want to do.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so before we get to the actual conversations in Portsmouth,
before we've actually gotten to
let's backtrack a little bit. What is Portsmouth's significance in the United States at this time? Because I've heard, I've only been here 2 years, but I've heard that Portsmouth didn't really become a destination until late 90s, early 2000s. That was kind of seedy before, but it's always been the Naval Shipyard, and we've had a lot of things passing through here.
Yeah. So, as you know, Portsmouth as a city settled by Europeans has been around 400 years. There were people living here for thousands, tens of thousands of years before that. So Portsmouth was the third largest port in the colonies in the late 1600s there's a lot of time between 1623 and 1775 that's the history we remember. But we'd spent 150 years as a trading port, familiar with people from all over the world and sending ships all over the world. I mean, we're famous for shipbuilding, particularly the clipper ships for which Clipper Country is named, which were the fastest sailing ships to get from here around the Horn to San Francisco and to China. So we're trading all over the world. So one of the arguments which Roosevelt would have known is that we were used to people from all over the world, which gets back to that not discriminating against the Japanese or the Russians for that matter. But we took care of Spanish prisoners from the Spanish-American War. So again, there's this international dynamic. And the officers who were prisoners at the shipyard were free to roam around Portsmouth. I mean, like now when we give the sailors from the submarines bicycles, well, the Spanish officers had bicycles to ride into Portsmouth.
Wow.
So we had that reputation. In addition to the clipper ships, Portsmouth Naval Shipyard was established in 1800. It is the first and longest continuously operating Navy shipyard in the country. So we had been building warships for a very long time. That the fortunes of places like Newport or Portsmouth or even Boston rise and fall with the tides of war in particular. So when things were going well and you needed warships, the city did well. Like now, it's why it was such a crisis in 2005 when Washington thought they would shut down the shipyard and the Brack Commission happened. And
I didn't know that was a possibility.
Yeah. 2005, we were on the list of the base realignment and closure exercise. And the shipyard unions in particular organized busloads of guys in yellow T-shirts that said, "Save our shipyard," to go to the hearings in Boston and say, "Save our shipyard." And oh, by the way, every time we have a contract, Portsmouth Naval Shipyard delivers on the contract on time and under budget. What are you talking about closing us down? And closing down the shipyard is eliminating 6,000 civilian jobs, half of which are in New Hampshire, half of which are in Maine, but it's a huge hit to the economy. We had been through the closure of the Air Force Base at Pease.
Right.
And we knew what it felt like. We don't want to do that. And the commissioners were dazzled by this influx of all these workers and the fact that we were on time and under budget, and said, "Yeah, you're right. We're not going to close the shipyard."
Oh, wow. Fascinating. Okay. Yeah. And again, as a quick aside, before we get to the meeting at the shipyard, I told a local map maker that I was talking to you, and he asked me to ask you, why is the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard in Kittery?
Funny you should ask, because George Washington is one that said Badger's Island was part of the city of Portsmouth. Now, New Hampshire was New Hampshire then, but Maine was not yet Maine. Maine was still part of Massachusetts.
Oh, so this is 1775-ish,
okay. Washington. So Maine didn't become a state until 1840.
I don't think I realized that it took Maine that long to become a state.
Yes.
Wow.
It's part of Massachusetts.
That is so funny that Maine was a part of Massachusetts.
So Maine was part of the Missouri Compromise, which is why I'm saying,
that was 1850. Yeah.
Yeah.
So the Missouri Compromise established Maine as a state.
Right. just to add confusion.
Love it. This is great.
So Washington and then the Supreme Court said that Badger's Island was part of New Hampshire. And it's a very interesting fun fact that in most states and most places, if you have a boundary that is a river, the boundary between states or counties runs down the middle of the river. Not in New Hampshire. The Connecticut River on our border with Vermont is owned by New Hampshire. Vermont doesn't start until land on the other shore. So similarly with the Piscataqua, the line is not down the middle. The boundary line now is down the middle because a later Supreme Court decision made Badger's Island and the shipyard part of Kittery. Well, at this point, Maine was a state. Maine was collecting income tax from those thousands of civilian workers and was not about to say, "Oh yeah, New Hampshire can have them." So that is why Portsmouth is Portsmouth Naval Shipyard, even though it's in Kittery. And there was much discussion and outrage in 1905 that it should be the Treaty of Kittery.
Oh.
But it isn't. And Portsmouth Naval Shipyard has a Portsmouth zip code. So There are many
Wow.
still who want the shipyard to be part of New Hampshire, but not yet.
Coming up, how the citizens of Portsmouth brought World War II to an end, and why Washington, D.C. has New Hampshire to thank for its cherry blossoms. That's next. But speaking of things that smell good, I had the honor of making my own candle from scratch at Sea Love Portsmouth last week. And now I feel ready to take on the fall with my coffee, cinnamon, and vanilla candle by my side. The process was way easier than I thought it would be. First, I chose my 3 favorite scents from their list of 100 plus scents available. Then I picked a vessel, took it to my seat at the candle bar, and then mixed droplets of each flavor together in said vessel after I placed the wick. To finish it off, I poured in the hot wax, set the candle aside to let everything settle, and then 45 minutes later, I had my very own DIY candle. The Sea Love Portsmouth experience is perfect for couples, bachelorette parties, parents and children, or really anyone who wants to flex their creative muscle without having to work too hard. To get yourself ready for cozy season with a cozy candle, you can make a reservation at sealoveportsmouth.com. And then when you show up, just tell the wonderful staff that you're a Seacoast Stories fan, and then you'll get 20% off your entire candle making experience. And when you're in the store, you'll also get a discount on all of the coastal goodies sitting on the beautiful shelves in their boutique. Before I bring today's guest back in, did you know that at this very second, I'm speaking to you from my walk-in closet? It's very good for sound quality, which is why when I went apartment hunting this time last year, I had to go with the only place that was offering exactly what I needed, the Brewery Lane Apartments from Chinburg Properties. I love this place. My neighbors are the best. The location just doesn't get any better. I live right next to some of my favorite Seacoast businesses, and some of my favorite episodes of this podcast were actually recorded in the common room of the building. But the best part is by far the rooftop. I've hung out there a lot this summer because it gives sweeping views of Portsmouth, and there's also my porch, which I enjoy a cup of coffee there in silence every morning before the chaos of the day sets in. I am really happy here. And if you're thinking of moving into a different apartment soon, I cannot recommend Chinburg Properties enough. They have availabilities right now in Portsmouth, Dover, Somersworth, Biddeford, and more. To learn more, just visit chinburg.com. Thank you, Chinburg, and thank you, Sea Love, for supporting the show. Now back to today's conversation with Stephanie Seacord, who takes us back to August 1905, when the Japanese and Russian delegates meet with President Teddy Roosevelt just prior to the peace talks in Portsmouth.
Both delegations meet with Roosevelt on his presidential yacht, Mayflower, in the harbor at Oyster Bay. He invited them to lunch, and it's the first time they've met each other. So he greets them. They're in a circle. He raises a glass for a toast and says, "May your countries reach peace for the benefit of mankind." And then he sent them to us. Put the Russians on the Mayflower, put the Japanese on the Dolphin. There is one guy from the State Department on the ground in Portsmouth, a man named Herbert Pierce. He is the 3rd Assistant Secretary of State. Roosevelt at this point is acting as his own Secretary of State because John Hay had died in July at his home at the Fells in Newbury. All these New Hampshire connections. It's wonderful. So Roosevelt was his own Secretary of State, but had been coached by Hay. So Pierce, the guy on the ground, has established a summer residence. One of the locals has donated his house on the water in Newcastle. So Pierce and his wife are there. Pierce is the guy who arranges the furniture to be brought up from Washington. He gets cars for transportation. He's the logistics guy. So key point that in having us be the host, so the Mount Washington would have been the hotel host, the accommodations, all of that good stuff. Well, so what do you do in Portsmouth? Wentworth by the Sea was comparably grand hotel for the era. So Governor McLean and his Secretary of State came to Portsmouth while all of the deciding of, okay, this is where it's going to be in June, came to Portsmouth to Calvin Page, Judge Calvin Page, this little plaque outside of the Piscataqua Savings Bank. If you look up on the wall, Calvin Page's office was there. His house used to be where the parking lot at the Masonic Hall is. Mm-hmm. And Calvin Page was the executor for Frank Jones. Frank Jones owned Wentworth by the Sea and had expanded it into its glory, took it from a little box into the wings and the Victorian turrets and all that good stuff. And Jones' will had said, I want you to treat my estate as I would. So when the governor comes and says, can you accommodate the Russians and the Japanese for this peace conference? Calvin Page, of course, said yes. So we have a hotel. We already have locals actively involved. So the parade comes up from the landing point where the Isles of Shoals steamship is, because there wasn't a bridge at that point. You had to come by water. So they were met on the New Hampshire side by the commander of the National Guard. They're in carriages, and Pierce is in a car, an open car, and they come up Market Street and then down Congress Street and around the corner and back down State in front of the Custom House to end up at what used to be the Rockingham County Courthouse, which is where the Piscataqua Savings parking lot is now. So the sidewalk, Congress Street looks now the way it did in 1905. The buildings are the same. The sidewalks are the same width. The sidewalks are packed with people. The whole parade route is packed, like 10 deep with people all dressed up. I mean, even little kids who are running along next to the carriages and the National Guard, they're all dressed up. There's a little girl holding onto her hat. It's hysterical. It's a Tuesday afternoon in August. All of those people had to leave their farms, their shops, their factories, get dressed up on an August afternoon to come to Portsmouth to cheer the arrival, like the opening of the Olympics, to cheer the arrival of both delegations. The buildings are decorated in red, white, and blue bunting because the business associations were specifically advised not to have Russian and Japanese flags because they knew the newspapermen would be counting up how many Japanese, how many Russian. Oh, Portsmouth clearly favors one side. So it's all red, white, and blue bunting. So the parade images are very festive looking. And the delegates were amazed with this outpouring of enthusiasm. I mean, that didn't happen in their experience. So the Russians at this point, with Tsushima and the army being sent across Siberia and the ship coming around Africa, the Russian people are saying, why are we doing this? And the Potemkin uprising happened. The mutiny on the Potemkin happened at the time of the Russo-Japanese War. So there are rumblings of revolution in Russia.
Okay.
It's really interesting. The whole exercise from the moment that both sides arrived in Portsmouth on through the peace conference, the media activity is amazing. That too is a 20th century thing.
Yeah.
Both sides were cultivating public opinion. So they go from the Rockingham Courthouse, end of the parade, to Wentworth. Check in to the hotel. The plan is to meet the next day to start the formal negotiations at the shipyard. All of the negotiations took place at the shipyard. So they had to go back and forth from Wentworth every day. Witte and Komura met at the shipyard on the morning of the 10th of August, just the two of them, basically to exchange their credentials and make sure that each of them was qualified to conduct these negotiations. And then they started with the 12 things that the Japanese had demanded and got through 8 of them, and where the 2 of them, the Japanese agreed to withdraw. The war was fought over control of Korea and fishing rights. Those were the key things. So among all of these demands is who's going to control Korea and the railway and the fishing rights. So in those 8 things that they agreed to over the course of the next 2 weeks, so up until about the 23rd of August, they went through all of these things one by one. And the Japanese insisted, logically, that once they had made basic agreement on a topic, that those minutes would be written up as an article of the treaty in specific detail. The Russians were willing to say, oh, well, we agreed that, yeah, you can control the railway. Well, the Japanese said, no, we've been here before. We're going to define this. So every night they wrote up the articles, and some of the original demands got combined into treaty articles. But after this almost 2 weeks of getting through the things that they had gone to war about and agreed on, they were left with 2 sticking points, which again is why it's brilliant that Roosevelt said, if you run into an impasse, keep going. Go on to the next thing. Go on to one of those other 8 things. The last 2 things were who was going to control Sakhalin Island. The second issue was an indemnity that the Japanese had won, so the Russians should pay them for the expenses of the war, which started out as a very high number. And the Tsar said, they didn't march on Moscow. We're not going to pay them anything. They may say that they won. We concede that they won the battles, but they didn't win. So we're not going to pay them anything. The negotiations broke off. Everybody thought it was over. They were going to go home. We weren't going to have a treaty. I mean, you can imagine similarly to thinking that maybe you'd get a ceasefire out of Alaska.
Right.
Not going to happen. So everybody went on to, well, what's the next step? So
at the end of each day of negotiations, was it public information, how they were going?
Again, both sides really cared about public opinion.
Yeah.
One of my favorite stories, and we're getting into the good part of this story, which is how local people felt. We had a sense of it with the parade. But one of my favorite stories is that when the 2 delegations came into the dining room, the other guests, and the hotel was full. It's a summer hotel. It's only open in the summer. It was already full, and they had moved people around to fit in the 2 delegations.
Gosh, imagine being one of the people staying there. And
I know.
Wow.
So the young women in particular, not only the hotel guests, but all of the young women with the summer people were entranced by all of these dashing officers in their uniforms who were reportedly good dancers. So when the delegates came into the dining room, everybody stood up quietly, politely, waited for them to be seated, and then they sat down. You can imagine then the buzz of all of the, did you see who that was? All of that. I love that story. That it's the era in 1905. You do that as a courtesy, but that we did, where some of the major metropolitan newspapers would comment about provincial Portsmouth. Well, we're not so shabby. We know how to do things. We've been a port since 1623. So the formal negotiations break down. Knowing that both sides cared so much about public opinion, I like to say that the face of public opinion becomes the hospitality of Portsmouth. Specifically, Mrs. Pierce, Herbert, Third Assistant Secretary Pierce's wife, Helen, who had grown up in Portland, hosted a dinner party early in that breakdown for the Russians and the Japanese. And as I remember, it turns out there were dozens of social events, which is what's so cool about this. I don't remember if that first dinner, if just the Russians or just the Japanese came, but they did come to dinner, because I can imagine Pierce coming home from the shipyard saying, oh my God, they're going to go home. Roosevelt's going to kill me. It's my fault. I should have done something different. And Helen saying, let's have a dinner party. I could just see that. So she had this dinner party. She had her friends. There were other summer people like Mrs. Astor Carey, who was at the Carey Cottage that's now restored and gorgeous out on Sagamore Creek. So she had friends. Her husband, Pierce, had also gone to Harvard. So Harvard friends and social friends all helped Mrs. Pierce with this dinner. At that point, she's the face of public opinion. And as the days went on, other people, other local, ordinary people hosted church picnics and concerts and dinner parties and teas. There was an elderly woman, 91-year-old woman, who had tea that someone had brought her back at that heyday after the Civil War. So you can imagine 40-year-old tea. So she hosted a tea party. Everybody did everything they could think of. It wasn't above their pay grade. Can you imagine doing that even now? I mean, as casual as we are, usually you don't have the opportunity because a peace conference like this would be sequestered away somewhere, right. Which is some of what happened at Versailles, which is why it ended up not going very well.
At the end of World War I.
Yeah. So you have all of this social interaction, which is what we now call citizen diplomacy. But here in Portsmouth in 1905, everybody, including those little kids who ran along with the parade, got into it because they are reading newspapers. It is a 20th century world when it comes to media. They've been reading about this war and the bloodshed and the horrible, I mean, there are, Harper's Weekly drawings of people hanging on barbed wire and horrible things like that. So they are very well aware, just as we are well aware of what's happening in Ukraine. It was day to day. And to me, the most fascinating part of history is the definition of history is you know what happened. You know what the outcome was. You have to put yourself in the moment where you didn't know what the outcome was going to be. And you're in a position to be able to host a dinner party or help your church with a picnic or just be there. 90% of success is showing up, just being there, providing that atmosphere that encouraged both sides to keep going. Vitae had 2 different telegrams from the Tsar saying, come home. The Japanese have conceded whatever they're going to concede. Enough. We're not going to pay them anything. We're not going to give up Sakhalin. Come home. Vitae ignored him. He put the telegrams effectively in his pocket and said, no, I think we're this close. Both Camorra and Vitae were statesmen, true diplomats. They had seen what the consequences, the results were of this war. So on the ground in Portsmouth, you're thinking, if I can do anything, if I can help feed people, if I can do anything to end this war, I'm going to do it. And they thought it was all going to collapse at any second. So 10 days of ongoing entertainments and, we believe in you, stay here. And everybody was coming back to Wentworth every night. So they were interacting. There would be a crowd on the porch when they came back from the shipyard. 10 days of this social citizen diplomacy. And they went back to the negotiating table and they agreed that they would divide Sakhalin in half and that the Russians would pay the Japanese for the expenses of taking care of the Russian prisoners of war. Now, the specifics of that are due to back-channel diplomacy, formal, above our pay grade stuff that Roosevelt was doing. He had somebody in St. Petersburg talking to the Tsar and he had somebody in Tokyo talking to the War Council. And both Witte and Komura were lingering because they were waiting for instructions from their government. But they were also in this atmosphere that, now we had converted them to our side of believing in the peace. So they stayed. And on August 29th, they met at the shipyard. They said, okay, Japan gets half of Sakhalin and Russia will pay for the prisoners of war. And the bells of Portsmouth rang for half an hour.
Wow.
And the world began to congratulate Roosevelt for the success. And he reportedly said when he got, it was either a telephone call or a telegram. And he said, that's bully for Japan, bully for Russia, and bully for me. Because the United States was now to be considered a force in world diplomacy and in international relations. And you can't sweep us under the rug anymore.
Wow. This was a watershed moment for America's entrance into the world stage.
Yeah. As a force for good, as a force for diplomacy.
Is it fair to conclude that had this taken place somewhere else in America that was not as enthusiastic as Portsmouth was, that the delegates would not have been as inspired to keep going?
There are two reasons to say that's a logical conclusion. The first of which is what I said about how careful Roosevelt was in choosing Portsmouth, because he knew if it had been somewhere else, Bar Harbor, Newport, Boston, Washington, it wouldn't have worked. So there's that side. And there is what both sides said when they left Portsmouth. Each of them left $10,000 to the governor of New Hampshire to be used as he saw fit, but gave it saying, we will forever remember the hospitality of your state and the people of Portsmouth. And basically, to paraphrase, we couldn't have done this without you.
And Roosevelt would go on to win the Nobel Peace Prize for his role in brokering the peace.
Even though he never came.
Which is insane.
He orchestrated the whole thing, but he was the force, as you said, establishing the United States as a force for good in international relations. And one more fun fact. Did you know that the cherry trees in Washington are there because of the Portsmouth Peace Treaty?
I did not know that.
Great cocktail
like the famous
party.
Cherry blossoms. Okay.
Those very same cherry trees. The mayor of Tokyo was the one who arranged for 3,000 cherry trees to come to Washington when Mrs. Taft was in charge of the decoration of the tidal basin in Washington. That was created, literally dug out of the swamp in 1912. The mayor of Tokyo made the arrangements because even now, gifts like that, like the Statue of Liberty is a gift from France to America. It ended up in New York. The cherry trees were a gift from Japan to the United States in thanks for our help during the Russo-Japanese War. And the actual physical gift was from the mayor of Tokyo to the mayor of Washington, D.C. And the mayor of Tokyo said in his autobiography, I always wanted to do something to thank the United States for your help in the Russo-Japanese War. The only thing we did, we had observers. The only thing we actively did during the Russo-Japanese War was bring it to an end with the Portsmouth Peace Treaty. So the cherry trees in Washington are Portsmouth Peace Treaty cherry trees, which is why we now plant them all over the city and all over the state because they're the Portsmouth Peace Treaty living memorial. We didn't want a statue cherry trees.
I had no idea.
Yeah.
Nor had I noticed that we had all these cherry trees. I
You
guess
particularly
I'm
see
not that
them.
observant.
Well, and it's very much dependent on weather. Last year they didn't bloom, but this year they did. And there's a big line of them by City Hall around the South Mill Pond.
I'll be on the lookout. Wow.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for sharing this story with the benefit of hindsight. What do you think is the legacy of this treaty, and what does it say about the people of Portsmouth specifically?
So the legacy of the treaty on a national basis is that once upon a time, we had this kind of influence for good. But for Portsmouth, I mean, it's amazing. I think it's amazing that in 1905, people said, I can make a difference here. It emphasizes that ordinary people can make a difference, that it isn't above our pay grade, that we can have a voice in what happens, which is why the first in the nation primary is so critical, the presidential primary, because we know what we're talking about. We pay attention. We follow the headlines. We know what's going on a world basis. And I believe that's still true. Why in 1905 we had that attitude is probably has a lot to do with the Navy, because we're still a Navy town. We're used to the world internationally. But you were talking about, the legacy also of the people to people, which is what citizen diplomacy is. That is a key component. That is the basis for sister city relationships. The sister city international movement was started by President Eisenhower in 1960 some odd. So he, of course, being the famous general from Europe
Right.
in the Second World War, knew about peace and encouraged what he saw as the opportunity for people to talk to each other and discover they didn't have horns and tails. So, our first sister city relationship for Portsmouth was in 1985, the 80th anniversary of the Portsmouth Peace Treaty, when the city of Nishinan, Japan, reached out to us to say, because of the treaty, we think you'd make a great sister city, because Baron Komura was from Nishinan.
Is that why we have Nishinan restaurant? Wow.
So
I had no idea.
We are welcoming a delegation from Nishinan this week for the 120th anniversary. Another fun fact. I didn't realize that for the Japanese, combinations of 12 are significant events. For us, it's 50, 100, maybe 125, but 120th is a big deal. And the mayor of Nishinan and the chairman of their sister city, Friendship City Association, and the superintendent of schools, 7 people are here to celebrate the 120th anniversary of the treaty, the 40th anniversary of the Sister City Agreement, and Baron Komura's 170th birthday.
Wow. That's amazing. What else is planned for this week?
We're doing a mini reunion of the anniversary committee and with our guests from Nishinan on Wednesday night at the library at 6:00. Thursday morning, Mayor McEachern will greet his counterpart in council chambers, and then we're having a little, breakfast pastries reception for them.
So fun.
This is after these folks are going to be exhausted on Thursday because we start with a tour of the shipyard Building 86 at 8:00 Thursday morning. And then we go to the exhibit at the John Paul Jones House. We've had a major treaty exhibit there for 20 years. And we update it every year with different things. Next year, we'll be focusing on Roosevelt's Nobel Peace Prize. But this year, the exhibit has some of the programs and posters and photographs and stuff from the anniversary committee. So we'll go to the shipyard, then we'll go to the John Paul Jones House, then we'll go to the reception at City Hall. Then I'm going to take them to Wentworth by the Sea because they're staying at the Port Inn, which is sort of unfortunate because they're not in walking. Well, it's a long walk to downtown. Anyway, I'm going to take them to Wentworth because we have pictures from 1905 and take them to lunch there. Then Friday, the Speaker of the House in Concord is hosting a little reception for the Consul General of Japan in Boston, to which the Nishidan guests are invited. That's in the morning. Then they come back here for the major event every year of Portsmouth Peace Treaty Day. At 3:15-ish, we gather in front of, there's a historic marker in Market Square, opposite North Church. It's also happens, well, it's deliberately in front of the Piscataqua Savings Bank, where there's that plaque on the wall about Calvin Page. We start with a reading of the governor's proclamation of Portsmouth Peace Treaty Day, which is part of the deal when we did the legislation. She's been invited, but it's not likely. The governor usually doesn't come. So Mayor McEachern will read the governor's proclamation. We have letters from each of our congressionals. The Consul General from Boston will say a few words. And by this time, it's getting to 3:47, which is the moment the treaty was signed. And there's an extra whistle from the shipyard. It all depends on the way the wind blows. But usually you hear the whistle at 3:30, which is the end of the workday. This is another whistle at 3:47, which is in honor of the treaty. And that's the signal for all the bells of Portsmouth to ring. And we arrange with North Church, South Church, St. John's, the Baptist Church, everybody that you can hear to ring their bells, which is so cool because they're not synced. So one of them, we're standing there looking at our watches saying, is it 3:47 yet? And then one starts ringing and then another starts ringing. And then you hear one from over here and everybody, it's very spontaneous. Anybody who shows up, anybody walking by on the sidewalk, we have a little bell. Everybody rings their little bells. And it's so cool.
Mark your calendars, everybody. This Friday,
3:15 to start.
3:15, get downtown.
But if you wonder about why the bells are ringing at 3:47.
Everything's okay. Trust me.
Right. No earthquakes.
Wow. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Stephanie, for all the work you do in telling this story, not only to this audience, but to the people of the Seacoast. And so excited for all the events this week. We have one final question. We ask the same final question at the end of every episode every week. It's brought to you by Dave Higgins, our show's trusted advisor for financial services and planning as he grows his local business. He's also supporting our show, so we thank him for that. Please reach out to Dave by visiting the info in the show notes. Stephanie, if you were to leave this earth tomorrow, what would you want people to remember about you?
The treaty. All of the effort that we've gone into telling the story. And hopefully I have lived up to the legacy of citizen diplomacy. And 5 seconds ago, I didn't know that that's what I would say, but that is what I'd say.
I can guarantee no one else will ever give that answer on this show. So you are in rarefied air, Stephanie. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me. This is fun.
That's Stephanie Seacord, the Director of Public Affairs for the Portsmouth Peace Treaty Anniversary Committee. To celebrate one of the biggest days in Seacoast history, you can join me in Market Square this Friday to take in the official commemoration of the 120th anniversary of the Portsmouth Treaty. And if you'd be willing to support this podcast, you can do so by sharing your favorite episode with a close friend. Each time you tell someone about the show, it helps us with our mission of bringing the Seacoast closer together, one podcast at a time. Thank you for listening. And if you see me around town this week, perhaps at the Juicery, Loaded Question, or La Melita Coffee, please stop me and say hi. I would love to hear your story. Until next time, have a great week. Live free or die.